First of all, we indeed appreciate so much you showed up this early. And we're aware how cold it is, so it's absolutely fine if you grab your cup of hot beverage with you. So good morning, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We are here for the joint report of the Truth Hounds and Reporters Without Borders, which is called Last Check-in, the Russian strikes on Ukrainian hotels, silencing the press. We will be looking into the Russian patterns and tactics on targeting specific objects. Why does it make a specific crime? And if it makes, a crime. And by the way, we really need Volodymyr on that, on stage. Thank you so much. So let me shortly introduce our participants and the authors of this report. So on my left, Roman Koval, Head of Research, Truth Hounds. Pauline Moffret, Regional Office for Ukraine, Reporters Without Borders. Hello. Kenza Ramarwi, Senior Researcher at the Truth Hounds, and Volodymyr Hryshko, Senior Legal Counsel at the Truth Hounds. My name is Angelina Karyakina. I'm a journalist, researcher. I also work with documenting war crimes, and thank you for having me as well at this report. It's an extremely interesting and important work. So Roman, let me start with you. We all here in Ukraine and abroad, the people who are following this horrendous war, we can see that various objects are targeted in Ukraine, be it civilian infrastructure, be it energy infrastructure. We see some patterns with the Russians targeting hospitals, theaters, museums, schools, residential areas, or just, city infrastructure. What makes a hotel a special target and why?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the question. Well, from one side, we can see that we can look at attacks on hotels as a part of broader strategy of targeting civilian infrastructure by Russian armed forces. But the question we start our research with is what makes hotels a desirable target for the attacking party? And as usual, we started to research the history of different armed conflicts to try and to answer this question. And there are numerous examples in the history of other armed conflicts across the globe when hotels became target. But from our perspective, it's more interesting and more beneficial to look not on history of other armed conflicts, but on targeting hotels by terrorist groups. And from this perspective, the hotel as an object is a very interesting and desirable target for terrorist groups. And history knows numerous examples when hotels were attacked by terrorists, for example, in Somalia, in Pakistan, in Kenya, Afghanistan, and many other countries. So the question was why? And the answer here lies in the inherent logic of terroristic attacks. And when choosing a target, a terrorist group, they count on the symbolic value of the target and the symbolic value of hotels in those contexts stem from the very fact that the main guests of hotels are usually foreign diplomats, businessmen, journalists, and so on, all those who can be associated in the eyes of terrorists as a desirable and valuable and symbolic target. And the second And the second thing important for the terrorist groups when choosing to target hotels is the communication potential. Because of the foreign audience staying in hotels, terrorist group, by attacking these kind of establishments, they they could be sure that the message of them would spread across the globe because of the foreign audience and the great attention to this attack. So from this perspective, hotels could be a very desirable target, and we can assume that at least some of those reasons could be applicable to the context of armed conflicts, in particular the conflict in Ukraine. And what we did next, our next step, was to try to document who occupies hotels in Ukraine. And main categories staying in hotels during the armed conflict in the areas affected by active hostilities are mainly journalists, humanitarian aid workers, internally displaced person, sometimes soldiers meeting with their families, and so on. And from this perspective, that the very fact that those attacks after the first series of this attack, for example, of this kind of attacks, for example, in 2022 or early 2023, they escalated and intensified, even though the attacking party had an opportunity to examine consequences of first attacks on hotels, first strikes. And it's pretty clear that main victims of those attacks were civilians, and including journalists, including humanitarian aid workers and other civilians, specific groups of civilians dealing with the consequences of armed conflict, whether it's documenting the war or trying to minimize its effects on civilian populations.
You're stressing civilians. Does it mean that there is no correlation between the military presence and the attack?
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yes, it's one of the main points of our report that we were not that we established there are no clear correlation between the presence of military personnel in hotels and the likelihood of a hotel to be attacked. And we documented 31 attacks on 25 hotels across Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion and up to mid-March 2025. And only in one case, it was a hotel was used as a clear-cut military object. That means that in 30 other instances, hotels were occupied primarily by civilians and mainly by groups mentioned by me. And we also discovered some patterns, clear patterns, what makes those attacks on hotels very special and out of the line of of other attacks on different civilian objects, including hospitals, theaters, and so on. First of all, the geographical pattern that most of these attacks, 27 strikes, occurred in areas experiencing active hostilities. What is the characteristic of those areas? The main characteristic of those areas is that on them, the presence of these groups I mentioned, for example, journalists, humanitarian aid workers, and also military personnel, is very active, and they mobilize in those areas because their main working aims and working goals, they lie in these areas. So it could be part of explanation why hotels, especially in those areas, are the main target, because at that hotels, there's a pretty high guarantee that those groups which the attacking party wants to target will be present at hotels. The second pattern is a temporal pattern. It means that most strikes occurred between late evening and early morning, which could be used as evidence of intent that the hotel is target and was deliberate targeted because the
people were there.
The people were there, right? And another stone in our argumentation line is that at least 15 attacks involved missiles launched from Iskander missile systems. It means ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. They're pretty special in the line of different Russian missile weaponry because of the high precision, relatively high precision. So that means when most attacks, or the huge portion of those attacks occurred with the usage of such missiles, it means that the strikes were most likely precise. And yeah, the last point of mine here would be that it doesn't mean, well, in our report, we discussed that there are 4 main strategies for hotels to operate during the armed conflict, I mean in the areas affected by active hostilities. The first option is to completely stop any activity, any operations. The first one, to continue to operate under regular conditions, hosting civilians, sometimes military personnel, and other. Another strategy we discovered was that hotels remain open, but they refrain from accommodating military personnel. They had some strict policies against it. And fourth strategy, that hotels were used exclusively as to accommodate military personnel. And as I mentioned before, among those 31 strikes, among those 31 cases, only in one instance, a hotel was used completely by military personnel. But among those attacks, among those categories, among those strategies of operation, well, the basic conclusion is that no matter which strategy a hotel will choose to use, will choose to follow, the likelihood of it being targeted pretty much the same, because we know a lot of cases when hotels were refusing to accommodate military, for example, in the city of Kramatorsk, and the Hotel Kramatorsk and the Hotel Sapphire. We're going to talk more in detail about it. They hosted only civilians, and they hosted, in the Sapphire case, they hosted only journalists since the start of the full-scale invasion, so no military personnel during the whole period of the Russian full-scale invasion were staying there.
I think we will look into this case closer on a separate note, and a separate question. Pauline, now to you. I think there is no question, at least among this audience, that the Russians are targeting journalists, media. There is no question why are they targeting Ukrainian journalists, and there is wide evidence of how, where, and why they are doing. RSF has also contributed greatly to the investigation on what happened to Victoria Roshina, our colleague. In this regard, with targeting hotels, we also understand that it's not only the Ukrainian journalists who are targeted, it's also international journalists, and it looks like it doesn't matter for the Russians, where you come from as a journalist. So do they aim specifically at groups? That's one question. And secondly, what do you make out of it? What are the consequences of these attacks? Do journalists as a community understand this kind of threat? Not, the general threat of the war here in any, city of Ukraine, but specifically if you're a journalist and you're staying at the hotel, there might be a huge risk for you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Sorry, I'm trying to, yeah. So as Roman said, and as it's shown in the report, so this hotel were accommodating civilians, and among them, of course, journalists and media professionals. And I think this is something very, very important to recall, that for journalists and media workers working in armed conflict, covering it, going to Ukraine, hotel in such regions, so it's regions as Kharkiv, Dnipro, Odessa, Donetsk, where there are active hostilities. These are not only accommodation, but it's also a workplace, because for journalists going there, Ukrainian and international, The hotel is a place where they will write the articles after a full day of report, where they can edit their videos, where they can edit their podcast, and then send everything back to the media outlets in other cities of Ukraine or abroad. So it's I think it's also as a different use than only accommodation. And because these journalists are not living there, they are going there for maybe 1, 2, 3 days of report, and then or maybe more. The fact that this hotel were bombed, were striked, and that among them there were many media professionals, so it's not. Of course, it makes sense because these hotels are close to the front line and so on. And it makes sense because media professional needs to go there and to cover the situation. So they are using hotel, basically. I just would like to recall some figures, but I think it's important because we are speaking about people. So 25 journalists and media professionals came under Russian fire in their hotel. Among them, 7 were physically injured. And among them, 1 media worker died. His name was Ryan Evans. He's a UK citizen. He was a safety advisor for Reuters, and he died in a strike in his hotel, in the hotel Safir in Kramatorsk, where he was with his team, with his colleagues. 2 of his colleagues were also physically injured, and they were there for a report. It's very important because these strikes, this risk has real concrete consequences for media workers because they have to adapt because they know that there is a risk. By interviewing many different journalists, Ukrainian, international, by also there was a survey that was made for this report and that was spread among the media community working in Ukraine. We saw different consequences of the strike. One of the consequences for Ukrainian and international journalists is for them now to avoid staying in this hotel. So according to the survey, 64% of Ukrainian journalists and 43% of international correspondents, reporters, media workers now avoid to stay in such hotel near the front line in these regions where there are active hostilities because there is a risk, meaning that they will either look for sometimes private accommodation or sometimes they will have they will mitigate the risk by staying further, by going staying in city further from the front. For instance, journalists who need to go to Pokrovsk, to Konstantinivka, to Kramatorsk, they might stay either in Poltava, either in Dnipro. This has a concrete impact on the report, and this is also why we use the sentence silencing the press, because journalists who will not stay there in these cities, in these regions, as long as they used to, and as long as they need to provide a lot of report. And it has an impact on the coverage, because instead of spending maybe 2 days, 3 days, or full day in a city to interview people, to document the situation and so on, you might stay 2 or 3 hours. So of course, the report will be different. You will have less topic. Maybe you will be able to cover only 1 out of, I don't know, 2 or 3. And so it has an impact. For some of the journalists and media workers, some of them say that actually they do not go to these cities anymore. It's kind of suspended because of the risk. And again, it has an impact on the report because it means that something will not be covered anymore. And there is, of course, consequences for them in terms of organization, meaning that it takes more time to organize in a logistic way your mission, your work, to go in some areas, instead of instead of going in one hotel, the journalist and their team, they will look for private accommodations. They will rely on their own sources to find a safe housing there. So preparing a mission for them will take more time, actually, and it's also has more consequences for them because some of them have safety team with protocols. Some protocols are actually quite rigid and that are not adapted to the situation in Ukraine, to the situation of the war. And some of the journalists, for instance, freelancers, they're alone. So meaning that they are relying on themselves. So it's an additional pressure for them when they prepare the report and when they prepare the mission.
Can I just quickly ask? There are lots of journalists in the audience. With all that, and I'm also keeping in mind that I, as a journalist, will be spreading this report among my colleagues abroad, among the public broadcasters abroad, trying to say that it doesn't mean you don't need to work. You do need to work. We cannot stop working. It's obvious. But you also have worked on the set of recommendations for the journalists. So how do you get around this tactic? What do you do with that?
Yeah,
if we put aside the rigid safety protocols, which do not seem to be helpful in some cases.
Of course. Don't make me wrong. Journalists need to cover what is going on, but they need to be safe. And when they need to be safe, it means that the media outlets and the need to provide them trainings, IFAT, first aid, in a regular way, like every 6 months. Refreshers are much more needed. They need to have protective equipment. So it means that the media outlets need to invest in this protective equipment because it costs a lot. It means that they need to be able to rent a car that is an armored car. It means that they need to be able for international journalists to properly work with local producers with contracts, not only like this with contract. It needs to be mandatory because what also was shown in the report is like, of course, Ukrainian reporters adapt to the situation much more quickly because they know what is going on. They have different sources.
Or Ukrainian fixers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And they know what is going on. They have their own contact, and it's also can be a really important support for other journalists, for instance, to find a safe accommodation. Can be like private one, but safe accommodation. It's one of the recommendations is also to avoid this kind of staying in this hotel. And I think also what I wanted to touch upon is also the psychological consequences for journalists because and media workers more in general. It's like they know about the attack, and in the survey and different interviews that were conducted, for instance, Ukrainian reporters, most of them know someone who went through such a strike or heard about this. And international journalists are relying more on open sources, but it's something that is known and it has consequences for them, meaning like 45% say that they have like psychological trauma, there is some post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it will also impact the work because it creates stress, it creates anxiety. So in terms of recommendation, I think it's also needed for media outlets to provide an access to psychological support for all their team working in Ukraine and covering the full-scale invasion.
Thank you so much. This is what I wanted to hear. If you do recommend avoid staying in a hotel, I think it's very important. Kenza, now to you. We know and we hear and we see the Russian reactions quite often after the strikes on different objects. You know, we see this tactic of denial and then justification and then again denial. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but sometimes it does. The way they explain, you know, these attacks say a lot about the tactic itself. But what was particular in your report, and what I personally find very, very interesting and kind of new, is also threatening. I mean, we don't hear Russians normally threatening civilians staying, I don't know, in a hospital, and they do target hospitals, going to a museum or an exhibition, and they do target museums and exhibitions. We know that, not for the reason that the military are present there. So we know all that. What is particular with the hotel and with journalists? What the Russian propaganda and your research on the Russian narratives and the Russian propaganda tell us?
Thank you for the question. And indeed, you touched a really interesting point about the threat. I'll go back to it a bit later. So the reason why we decided to analyze the justifications behind the attacks, so we were curious whether there were single explanations or to identify patterns, or if there were like which disinformation tactics. And indeed, we could identify two main narratives. So the first one is at the hotel, where the hotel after the attack was hosting foreign militaries, foreign instructors, and the second justification is that it was hosting Ukrainian armed forces. So usually these narratives were first spread by the Ministry of Defense, and then they were repeated. So they were repeated by other actors, especially on Telegram. So what we can see is that the Ministry of Defense usually shows the way to follow, and then these narratives are recuperated after. And one difference also that the Ministry of Defense usually comments less frequently and less details, but the core is here and it's recuperated after on several channels on Telegram with much more details and sometimes, some different details about the attacks. So for this research, we analyzed several channels on Telegram, thanks to an artificial intelligence platform which is called Ozavul, and we could analyze more than 35 different channels with different categories. So we took a look at state media, at pro-Kremlin commentators, at military bloggers, and also at anonymous channels, like which are really influential among the like on Telegram with a lot of followers. And by analyzing their comments after the attacks, what we could see is that they usually show the same narratives. So recurrent topics and recurrent words. And this show that the visions were aligned. So this show that there's like almost like a connection between all the narratives. And one of the most common narrative was actually the expression of foreign mercenaries. This we could see this like so many times after the attacks, and we came to the conclusion that the approach of the justification after the attacks is to justify the attacks and to show that that journalists are really seen as hostile, and they are really I remember in the survey you mentioned that there was a survey. There was one comment from a journalist who said that it's almost as we are undesired witnesses, and I think that's the main thing that we can see when we analyze the justifications about from Russian authorities or from Russian Telegram channels. That journalists are really seen as hostile and not independent, and they really bother the justification dynamics. So most of the times what we can see that the difference between journalists and combatants is blurred. So like one example among many others, at the Park Hotel in Kharkiv after the attack, there was back then a Georgian and a Turkish citizen. And one famous anonymous channel, which is called Zapiski Veterana, said that these two journalists were mercenaries, right? So their characteristic as a journalist is straight away wiped off because they are seen as combatants. They are associated as combatants. And this same channel, actually, Zapiski Veterana, in another post said that journalist is actually a cover for mercenaries. So it's clearly well said, right? And sometimes we can see that sometimes there can be a small distinction in their justification between a journalist and a soldier. But when they make such distinction, it is still, like, the aim is still to show that journalists are seen as an acceptable target, or that they are like a tool serving the Ukrainian army's purposes. So they are never seen as independent journalists doing their job out covering the war, but they're really seen as serving a military purpose. So I'd like to recall here about the Sapphire Hotel. That was back in 2023, so before the attack. There was already a message from the Ministry of Defense saying that this hotel, which, as Roman said, only hosts journalists, this hotel hosted journalists who were invited by Ukraine Security Service on purpose to report on staged incidents by the Ukrainian Security Service so that it could be used after against Russia to say that they are committing war crimes. So there's really like this this message that journalists are no longer seen as journalists, but really as, yeah.
I think it's a very interesting argument, because when we look at how the Russians are treating Ukrainian journalists in captivity, almost 30 of them held incommunicado, civilian journalists, but some of them receiving the status of prisoner of war while they were not non-combatants. For example, like our colleague Dmytro Chyliuk. It also says a lot about the way the Russians are treating Ukrainian journalists. But you've mentioned, three of you already mentioned the attack on the Sapphire Hotel in Kramatorsk in 2024. Before we turn to Volodymyr and legal framing of these attacks, I want you, Roman, to explain what makes this particular attack special. What is special about this attack, and what have we learned in this report, through this report, while you were looking, at the testimonies of the people who survived and the witnesses who survived this attack?
Well, the attack on Sapphire Hotel, just a drop of context, occurred at the Independence Day, August 24, last year, 2024, and it's one of the most tragically but well-known attacks because of the Reuters team were staying at the hotel. And Eskenza underscored that there are solid grounds to believe that Russian side, and including the military of defense, they knew that this hotel is used by journalists, and they published their comments about that back in 2023. It's the first thing. It's an evidence of an intent. And the second thing, the very fact we found out during our field research, is that this hotel, since the very start of the full-scale invasion, was used exclusively for journalists and for international media teams. It correlates with what the Russian Ministry of Defense stated. And the other thing is their very approach to justify this attack, because all those things Kenza mentioned about the main lines and main approaches in justifying those such attacks, in disinformation strategies and so on, they are all relevant to this case. Because Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov, after the attack, he tried to do exactly the same thing to blur the distinction between combatants and journalists. He said that the Ryan Evans was some kind of a security advisor, and that's not a clear case, and so on and so on. And after that, the spokeswoman of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs she supported this line of argumentation, actually. And that's exactly the words from Russian officials, which can be observed in Russian Telegram channels, in all those at the first sight not related kind of sources, was not related with Russian officials. But the strategies of communicating, of justification of these attacks, they're pretty much the same. And both Russian officials and Russian anonymous Telegram channels, war correspondents, and so on, they share the same approach and the same altitude to the media professionals working in Ukraine. They see them as a kind of combatants in the area of information warfare.
Kenza, there was also mentioning in the report about the foreign journalists who covered Kursk operation. Would you explain a little bit how the Russians reacted to that, and what's the story there?
Yes, so I think I'd like to go back to your first question when you mentioned the threats against journalists, and this is it. So the journalists who went to cover to Kursk Oblast, criminal cases were opened against them because they illegally crossed the border. And there's actually a connection here with the Safir Hotel that I'd like to highlight. There's a Romanian journalist who reported from Kursk Oblast, and a criminal case was opened against him. And when we look at the narratives and the justifications on Telegram channel again, we found that the same channel that I mentioned earlier, Zapiski Veterana, which comments really actively on the hostilities and everything and the attacks, they said that it's really violent, but they say that the threat of an Iskander missile is more efficient than a criminal case. So here they refer both to the criminal case against this journalist, but also to the previous. This was really close after the attack on the Safir Hotel. So they use the attack on the Safir Hotels, which led to the death, to the killing of one media worker, as a way to threaten and to intimidate other journalists. And I think that when you look at the justification that I used, it's insane the way that they don't try to hide, or they don't try to minimize, or it's really explicit that everything is justified, and in a way it's because journalists which are not journalists deserved it, and if they try to cover again, well, be careful, there might be risks. So the threat is really explicit against journalists.
It was quite effective in a way, because a number of Western media who still have at least one journalist in Moscow working, very carefully there. So these media really had to think twice before sending their journalists to Kursk and just to witness the Kursk operation. Thank you so much for this, Volodymyr. Now to legal framing. We understand that not every strike constitutes a war crime. With the hotel attacks, do all of them, or do specifically, this category of attack constitute really a war crime? That's my first question. And also, just for you to continue, we frequently hear that, there are fears among civilian population that if there is at least one soldier in a room, it may, constitute a threat, and it may it may justify the Russian attack, and it may make this object a justifiable military attack. Could you explain why it's not like that in reality? And just explain us a little bit about the proportionality of the strike, and just generally about the legal framing of this category of attacks.
Sure, thank you so much. So I think I'll start with covering this first part about journalists as protected group under international humanitarian law and as a part of civilian population, and that attacks against them are illegal as such. We've seen the possibility, not like the possibilities, but the efforts Russia state media also put in justifying these attacks. And one would question whether these justifications are apt from the legal point of view, right? When we talk about like targeted objectives, right, there is indeed an exception where civilians could be targeted. But this exception is very narrow. It relates only to those persons who are actively and directly engaging in hostilities. And the word hostilities here is key and crucial because it does not refer just to participation in war or participation in war effort, but right, participation in hostilities as waging warfare, actual warfare. So even their claims that someone was, for instance, previously a combatant, as with Ryan Evans, that he was a serviceman in British Army, or their claims with Safir attack, as Kenza mentioned, that the journalists were not there just to report from the scene, but they were there with contacts with security service of Ukraine and with a specific mission to stage some incidents, to report them to the West, and then to use these as propaganda for bolstering Western support for Ukraine. Even if these things are taken for granted as true from the Russian side, they do not make those persons a legitimate target, the journalists themselves. Because as I provided here also a citation, like these general war sustaining activities, such as political, economic, or media activities supporting the general war effort, do not meet the required threshold of this direct participation in hostilities. The example of direct participation in hostilities would be journalists taking up arms and fighting back.
Sorry, and this quotation goes from?
It goes from the commentary from the International Committee for the Red Cross on this notion of direct participation in hostilities.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Because, sorry for not including it there directly, but they explained why these media reportings would not make journalists participating in hostilities and legitimate targets. And same, for instance, with Ryan Evans, as I mentioned, when Russia tried to justify it because he was previously a serviceman for British Army. First of all, the previous engagement in a foreign army does not make him a combatant in this war of Russia against Ukraine. And even if we talk about like Ukrainian military officers, for instance, who retired, they would regain their civilian status. And if they do not anymore serve in the army, they would not be any more a legitimate target from the point of international humanitarian law. So we see here, to generalize, right? We see here from the Russian state and from the Russian side, their efforts to justify it either from the point of facts that there were foreign mercenaries or the hotel was full of foreign mercenaries which are not corroborated by real evidence and by testimonies, and which is false from the point of view of facts. And we see that sometimes they could use some real facts which are correct, but they would still not make the justification right from the legal point of view, right? As in case with Ryan Evans or other journalists suspected in some criminal activities. And for instance, this mentioning of covering the Kursk operation and opening a criminal offense would still also not make this person liable to attack. It could make this person liable to a criminal investigation under the national legislation, but not under an Iskander attack from the foreign army. So that goes for the persons, right? And turning back to your second question, I would say on the fact that the presence of militaries, why would not make it an object where they are staying a legitimate one? So the biggest problem is that there are some objects which are by nature civilian ones, but they could turn into military objectives for sure. And for instance, even our report, Roman mentioned in the beginning, documented one case of a hotel which was used as a military hub or military center, solely by soldiers. He stopped executing its civilian functions, and it turned into military objectives, and we could not speak about it as a war crime in this case. But in terms of other hotels, which either did not accommodate militaries at all or accommodated both civilians and militaries, the fact is that an object would turn into a military one only when they are actively used as a military objective. Not only the presence, simple presence of militaries in there is required, but the actual use. And for instance, I also here provide as an examples as a command center, a logistical hub, or a sniper position. In our case, with the hotels we documented, apart from this only one exception, even when the Ukrainian servicemen were hosted by the hotels, they were there in their private capacity, often accompanied by their partners from civilian life, and they were there like off duty. They would not make them civilians, for sure. They would remain as combatants, right? But this shows that their purpose of staying in a hotel was not to make this hotel a civilian object, was not to fire from this hotel, for instance, but just to reside there on the same terms as civilians do reside there, right? And residing there just in their private capacity. So these factors would not indicate that the object as such would turn into a military objective, or that the civilians would also somehow be blurred because of the presence of military officers there.
Thank you so much for the clarification. I want to go back to the beginning when Roman said that you started the report by looking not at the military tactic per se, but rather terrorist attacks on the hotels. Having that in mind, what does it mean legally? There's no doubt Russia is a terrorist state, but still it's a state army, and there is also like a state tactic behind it as well. Still, what's the essence of these attacks? Is that really just to spread terror among everyone, the media, the civilians, the local personnel? What is the connection between the terrorist tactic, and the strikes, and what's the aim?
Right, thank you. So with terrorism, actually, it's quite a bit more difficult from the legal point of view, because we have this like special framework which applies to armed conflicts and wars, which is international humanitarian law. And this is why sometimes in the media there is claims about terrorist attacks from the Russian side, and then there are some comments from legal experts, for instance, saying that it's not very accurate to say and to frame it as a terrorist attack, because, actually, if we talk about this term, the terrorism as such would more be related to non-governmental armed groups which are fighting or using violence as a political tool to get some demands from from a government, right? And not about interstate violence. However, with the interstate violence, we still have mentioning of this terror, and it is more mentioned in terms of instigating extreme fear among the civilian population. So we are speaking about this war crime of terror against the civilian population, and it was equated with the notion of extreme fear, and it was also used in the jurisprudence. This is
so that's a term from international humanitarian law.
There is a term of spreading terror,
okay.
Not terrorism, right? But spreading terror, which would also be about that. So we would not talk about the crime of terrorism, but we would talk about the war crime of spreading terror against civilian population. And this goes with, there is some difference with ordinary terrorism, I would say, because first of all, it would not require some political demands from a government, which is typical for just terrorism from non-governmental groups. It would instead be required to prove that these action instilled some extreme fear for the civilian population, that there was an intent not only to target the civilian population, but also to spread this extreme fear. So we've seen also from Pauline the reportings about this psychological trauma of journalists and them not being able or not wanting to come back and reside in the hotels. That is mainly because, and as Roman said also about night attacks of these hotels from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. It's specifically because the targeting of these places of rest and shelter, I would say, in the active combat zone, which are perceived by journalists, the hotels are perceived as a shelter, right? They are specifically targeted, and these they are deprived of their sense of security being there in these hotels. So this is why we could actually speak not only about the directing of attacks against civilian population, which the journalists remain, or civilian objectives, which the hotels remain, but also about this war crime of spreading terror among civilian population and journalists.
Thank you. I think it's a very important point here. And of course, there is a question, what do we do next with this report? But because we have just only 10 minutes left, and I want to open the audience for the questions and then take a privilege of myself being a moderator and also have a question from myself very quickly, if you could have a quick answer probably to Roman. So there is also a part in your report where you look into the Ukrainian attacks on the hotels in the occupied territories. So what actually are your findings? You looked into that. What did you find out?
Yes, we did. And just a brief comment about the main challenges. The main challenge, of course, is the lack of absence to the occupied territories, and we are not able to document properly these attacks. But let's switch to the differences. Well, we documented via open sources at least eight attacks, Ukrainian attacks on hotels in Russian-occupied territories. And at least 4 of them have clear signs of military presence. They were occupied by Russian special forces like FSB, by Wagner private military company, and so on and so on. So clear evidence of military use. With another 4 instances, it's hard to determine what exactly was located there and who exactly stayed there. But what we can share and what we can say about them pretty confidently is that there were representatives of local occupation structures, for example, occupation administrations, and there were hotels in Kherson region. There was a hotel in Kherson region, for example, which was targeted by Ukrainian armed forces, where Volodymyr Saldo was staying. And this is the area which requires an additional examination, particularly in terms of how exactly Volodymyr Saldo was related, and if he was related to, for example, managing the armed forces or something like that. It's necessary to establish his direct connection to military activities and so on. And about the differences, to sum up, the first difference, of course, it's a number of such attacks, 8 against 31 at least. The second difference is that at least half of Ukrainian attacks were targeted on clear military objectives. And even if there were no military in the second half, those another 4 attacks, the pattern is clear and the intent is clear to target the representatives of local occupational forces and so on, not journalists, not humanitarian workers, not others, these special categories of civilians. So the very intent and very rationales behind those attacks, it's pretty clear they're different.
Thank you so much. Now I'll open the floor to the questions. Please introduce yourself. There is a hand by a young man over there, yes, and have your question.
Good morning, my name is Łukasz Mackiewicz. I have a perspective from humanitarian international staff going on. So basically the first point observation would be It's not going to be affected journalists, it's also humanitarian organization, changing the standard operating procedures, not going to the same places, affecting. So it's not only limiting space for journalistic work, but also shrinking space for other actors. Number two, let's think about organizations. It costs money to send journalists there. For international organization, it takes up to 15-20% of the budget for security provision. Basically, it's cost of doing business. For you, you're not going to be sent because there is no money in the system as we know it. Number three, it's going to change the profile, who is going to go there. So the question of liability of insurance. So what you're going to do, you're going to send freelancer. When you're going to send freelancer, they have no coverage. When you send freelancer, everybody going to say they are not independent, they are actually making up the news. So this is also a clear narrative to limit the space from the experience from the other sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Another hand? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Natalia Gladkova. I represent Ukrainian archive at Mnemonic. Like fantastic work, teams of reporters.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
My name is Natalia Gladkova. I represent Ukrainian archive at Mnemonic. Thank you so much for a fantastic work, Truth Hounds and Reporters Without Borders. I just would like to get a few clarifying questions. One is about the survey among international journalists and Ukrainian journalists. As the difference is quite large, it could be explained on the one hand by the fact that local journalists are better informed, and another one is linked to the travel budget of local journalists. And as my colleague has mentioned, with regards to the insurance, that local journalists are like hardly covered by international insurance in case of something. I also have a clarifying question on the basements and shelter systems in the hotels that were hit. Were there any shelters present? That made me think about even the venue we're staying at the moment, that we feel safe being in a shelter, but we are surrounded by the military objects, by the military educational center and the base of the National Guard. So it will be so easy to justify, oops, we just missed a little bit. So I'm also wondering about the presence of military objects around the hotels. If you could clarify a little bit on this.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you. Who wants to take the question? Pauline?
Yeah, I can take on the journalists and the differences, of course. Completely agree also with your three comments. It costs money and it is complicated to, this mitigation measure costs money. So of course, when you are a freelancer or small media, it's very complicated to be implemented. And also the report shows actually different measures that were taken. Like for instance, for some big media, national or international, it might be, okay, we will stay and accommodate our staff further from this region. For some other, it's for them a question of relying more on local producers, fixers, and to go to private accommodation. And they also have different approach on their visibility, if I can call it like this. Some of them adopted a low profile, like car without any sign of press, protective equipment without being without press written on them, because for them it means that they can be a target. And for other, it's important for them to keep this sign because it can protect them. So it really depends on actually on the journalist and their media. There is also a question of insurance. Agree. Insurance costs a lot, and it was not for this report, but RSF, we also worked a bit on that, and actually we asked insurance in general overall, why does it cost that much? Because it costs that much means that many journalists, freelancers will not take them and they will not be protected at all. So there is, from us, a need from also insurance companies to work on that and to also propose affordable insurance that can cover the journalists and people working there, but with affordable price. Otherwise, it's, I mean, yeah, they don't take it and they are not covered. So there is a work and advocacy work also to be done on that.
And the last short question, if you have, yes, please go ahead. If there's a mic around. Thank you.
My name is Dmitro. I am local producer for the international media. Maybe I missed. Did you check the? Did you provide any kind of technical recommendation, like not using the foreign cell phones, laptops, AirTags, SIM cards, all the equipment which can emit the signal and can be identified like using from foreigners?
I can take it
Yeah, you
very,
can take this
very quickly. I mean, I didn't go to such details, but it's written in the reports. Indeed, so there's a different recommendation. For instance, it's to not use, to avoid using this hotel. And indeed, by discussing with journalists and media workers, some of them told us that they have digital security, their measures increased, meaning that they don't use geolocalization, they don't use any more international SIM card, Ukrainian SIM cards. So there are these mitigation risks that are taken by them. Not all of them, but it's becoming actually also from the information we got, not only in this report, but also by information we got in general from the journalistic community, it's widespread to have these mitigation measures.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. You can find the full report here under the QR code, so please go ahead. We're paper-free today. Oh no, we're not. You can see Olena, and she's holding some of the reports. So if you need a paper, this report in paper, please come up and take your copy. Thank you so much for being here again. Thank you for this work. Stay safe.